In the suffocating heat of a Guadalcanal jungle on August 21, 1942, Marine Private First Class William Hawkins crouched in the mud-filled foxhole as the inhuman screaming grew closer. During the Guadalcanal campaign, on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 800 soldiers in a direct attack on the American line guarding Henderson Field in the Battle of the Tenarue. The sound that would haunt American servicemen throughout the Pacific War was building to a crescendo. The terrifying battle cry of Tenno Heika Bansai, echoing through the darkness as hundreds of Imperial Japanese soldiers prepared to charge directly into the Marine positions. But Private Hawkins had something in his hands that would turn him from prey into predator. Something that Japanese soldiers had learned to fear more than any other weapon carried by American forces. A Colt Model 1911A1 .45 caliber pistol. What happened in the next few minutes would be repeated thousands of times across the Pacific theater, from the steaming jungles of New Guinea to the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, as a Japanese soldier charged a group of Marines, an American emptied a 15-round clip into the enemy soldier, who kept coming at the Marines. Another Marine drew his .45 and put the Japanese down with a single shot to the chest. This was not just another war story or piece of battlefield mythology. This was the harsh reality that shaped Japanese tactical thinking and psychological preparation throughout World War II. The Colt .45 had earned a reputation so fearsome among Japanese forces that it would fundamentally alter how they approached combat with American troops. The roots of Japanese fear of the .45 can be traced back to the very origins of the weapon itself, forged in the crucible of America's previous encounters with fanatically determined Asian warriors. American units fighting Tausug guerrillas in the Moro Rebellion in Sulu during the Philippine-American War, using the then-standard Colt M1892 revolver, .38 long Colt, found it to be unsuitable for the rigors of jungle warfare, particularly in terms of stopping power, as the Moros had high battle morale and often used drugs to inhibit the sensation of pain. The U.S. Army briefly reverted to using the M1873 single-action revolver in .45 Colt caliber, which had been standard during the late 19th century. The heavier bullet was found to be more effective against charging tribesmen. The parallels between the Moro warriors of the Philippines and the Japanese soldiers of World War II were not lost on American military planners, or more importantly, on the Japanese themselves. Both cultures emphasized honor over survival. Both were willing to die rather than surrender, and both had shown an almost supernatural ability to continue fighting despite wounds that would incapacitate soldiers from other armies. The history of the M1911 begins in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, when U.S. soldiers and Marines found themselves locked in fierce combat with the Moro, a knife-wielding native insurgency that combined religious zeal and potent drug use. Much of the fighting was close-quarters battle, and the hopped-up Moros took round after round from U.S. through .38 caliber pistols while they continued to hack away at Americans. It often took just one well-placed shot from the .45 caliber pistol to kill a Moro. By 1942, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence had already compiled detailed reports on American small arms, and one weapon stood out above all others in their assessments of threats to Japanese forces. The American M1911A1 .45 caliber pistol possessed incredible short-range knockdown power. What made this particularly terrifying to Japanese soldiers was not just the weapon's ballistics, but what those ballistics meant in the context of Japanese military doctrine and tactical preferences. The Japanese military had built its entire Pacific War strategy around several key tactical concepts that had served them well in China and during the early months of the war. Surprise attacks, night operations, and the devastating effectiveness of the Banzai Charge. Banzai Charge or Banzai Attack, Japanese Banzai 2G or Mosui 2G, Romanized Banzai Totsugeki, is the term that was used by the Allied forces of World War II to refer to Japanese human wave attacks and swarming staged by infantry units, and was shortened to Banzai, specifically referring to the bayonet charge tactic used by the Imperial Japanese Army during the Pacific War. This tactic was used when the Japanese commanders of infantry battalions foresaw that a battle was about to be lost, as a last-ditch effort in thwarting Allied forces. But the .45 caliber pistol represented a perfect counter to these tactics, a weapon designed specifically for close-quarters combat, with devastating stopping power. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the spiritual superiority of the imperial soldier, the power of will over technology, and the effectiveness of closing with the enemy to negate American advantages in firepower. But the .45 ACP cartridge, with its massive 230-grain bullet traveling at 850 feet per second, represented a technological reality that no amount of spiritual fervor could overcome. The original .45 cartridge has a full metal-jacketed projectile weighing 230 grains, which traveled at 850 feet per second. The .45 bullet weighed twice as much as the standard 9mm projectile of the time. This was not just superior firepower. This was a weapon system that could physically stop a charging human being with a single hit. The psychological impact of this reality on Japanese forces cannot be overstated. Throughout the war in China, Japanese soldiers had grown accustomed to facing opponents whose small arms ammunition lacked stopping power. In the 1930s, the Japanese found this type of attack to be effective in China. It became an accepted military tactic in the Imperial Japanese Army, where numerically weaker Japanese forces, using their superior training and bayonets, were able to defeat larger Chinese forces. Due to the low standardization of Chinese equipment in the National Revolutionary Army, the Japanese here seldom faced massed automatic weapons and more frequently encountered Chinese units armed only with bolt-action rifles, which could not fire as rapidly as a machine gun. Against such opposition, the Banzai Charge had proven devastatingly effective, creating a sense of tactical invincibility that extended beyond mere military doctrine into the realm of cultural identity. But American forces, particularly in close-quarters combat situations, were equipped with a weapon that had been specifically designed to deal with exactly the type of fanatical, close-range attacks that were the cornerstone of Japanese tactics. The .45's effectiveness was not theoretical. It was proven in combat again and again, and word of its devastating power spread through Japanese ranks like wildfire. Translate that to trying to stop some fanatical Japanese in the middle of a Banzai charge, and you can see why the .45 was so well liked by actual combat veterans. Translate that to trying to stop some fanatical Japanese in the middle of a Banzai charge, and you can see why the .45 was so well liked by actual combat veterans. The technical specifications of the .45 ACP round reveal why it was so effective against the type of determined attackers Japanese doctrine produced. The 1911 was specifically designed to fire the powerful .45 automatic Colt pistol round. Fired at a relatively low muzzle velocity, the round would embed itself upon impact. Unlike high-velocity rifle rounds that might pass through a target, the .45 ACP was designed to transfer all of its kinetic energy to whatever it struck. For a soldier charging at close range, this meant instant, devastating trauma that would stop forward momentum regardless of the attacker's determination or chemical enhancement. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with American .45s spread stories throughout their units about the weapon's almost supernatural stopping power. These were not exaggerated tales, but accurate descriptions of ballistic reality. The 45 ACP, with its 230-grain bullet, does have stopping power, but it should not be considered magical. That big 45 bullet still needed to be placed on target with care for it to be effective. But when it was placed on target, the results were consistently devastating, creating a psychological effect that went far beyond the weapon's actual capabilities. The fear that Japanese soldiers developed for the 45 was compounded by their own inadequate sidearms. Called the suicide gun for its unsafe design and poor manufacturing quality by American servicemen who learned about them the hard way, the Nambu Type 94 pistol was despised by all who had to fire it. Countless Japanese soldiers perished when they were unable to load and fire their sidearms quickly enough. The contrast between Japanese pistols and the American 45 was stark and humiliating. Where American forces carried a weapon renowned for its reliability and stopping power, Japanese soldiers were equipped with pistols that were as likely to harm the user as the enemy. The Type 94 pistol's shortcomings were legendary even among Japanese forces. The bottlenecked 8mm Nambu cartridge the Type 94 fired compared poorly to the hard-hitting American 45. Pushing a light 102-grain bullet out at 900 feet per second, this anemic round did not have the stopping power needed in a modern defensive firearm. Poorly made ammunition resulted in frequent misfires or failures to feed, usually at the worst possible time. Japanese officers who could afford to do so often purchased commercial European pistols rather than rely on their issued sidearms, a clear indication of their lack of confidence in Japanese small arms technology. But the fear of the 45 went beyond its technical superiority over Japanese weapons. American combat veterans quickly learned that the 45 was particularly effective against the types of attacks that Japanese forces favored. Many soldiers carried the M1 carbine during the war, a light rifle designed to replace the pistol. However, stories abound of the 45's stopping power being superior to the diminutive rifle. In the Philippines, 2 American pilots sat in their tent when a group of native headhunters attacked. One pilot had a carbine and shot a headhunter twice in the chest to no effect. As the native raised a machete, the other pilot shot him once in the forehead with his 45, dropping him instantly. The carbine was quickly traded for a 45. These combat experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that Japanese intelligence could not ignore. The 45 consistently demonstrated superior stopping power compared to other American small arms, and this effectiveness was most pronounced in exactly the type of close-quarters, high-intensity encounters that Japanese forces sought to create. The psychological impact of this reality on Japanese tactical planning was profound. They were being forced to abandon their most effective tactics because of a single American weapon system. The Banzai Charge, which had been the ultimate expression of Japanese military spirit and tactical doctrine, became increasingly difficult to execute effectively against American forces armed with 45s. The Japanese defenders then launched a Banzai Charge with bayonets and swords, but were stopped by American firepower. The pattern was repeated in further attacks, with similar results. What had once been a nearly unstoppable tactic that combined spiritual fervor with tactical surprise was being neutralized by American firepower, with the 45 playing a crucial role in close-quarters defensive fighting. The largest Banzai Charge of the war demonstrated both the continued Japanese commitment to this tactic and its ultimate futility against prepared American defenses. The largest Banzai Charge of the war took place during the Battle of Saipan. General Yoshitsugu Saito gathered almost 4,300 Japanese soldiers, walking wounded and some civilians, many unarmed, and ordered the charge. On July 7, 1944, it slammed directly into the Army's 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, which lost almost 1,000 men killed and wounded in the 15-hour pitched battle. The attack was ultimately repulsed, and almost all the Japanese soldiers taking part in the charge were killed. What made battles like Saipan particularly significant in terms of Japanese fear of the 45 was not just the ultimate failure of the Banzai charges, but the manner in which they were stopped. Anytime they cornered a large force, they would hear the preparations for Banzai, so the Marines and soldiers prepared their defense, massing ammo in each foxhole, fixing bayonets, and ensuring that knives were sharp and near to hand. Then, when they heard silence, they would brace themselves until the screaming charge started. American forces had learned to counter the Banzai charge not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through careful preparation and the use of weapons like the .45 that were specifically effective at close range. Individual Japanese soldiers who survived these encounters carried with them traumatic memories of facing American .45s in close combat. Unlike rifle fire, which could miss or wound without stopping an attacker, the .45 was renowned for its ability to end a fight with a single shot. Colonel Walter Walsh, in peacetime an FBI agent and renowned marksman, shot a Japanese sniper through the embrasure of a bunker at more than 75 yards with his pistol. As one of the enemy planes flew close to check their handiwork, Baggett raised his .45 and fired, killing the pilot. A Japanese officer later stated the pilot died from a single shot to the head. These were not lucky shots, but demonstrations of the weapon's effectiveness in the hands of trained American personnel. The psychological impact of such encounters created a feedback loop that amplified Japanese fear of the .45 far beyond what the weapon's actual distribution in American forces might have warranted. Despite this official stance, pistols were issued in ever-increasing numbers during the war. As an example, the U.S. Marine Corps' TOW in 1942 authorized 798 .45 pistols for a division, but by 1945, the authorized figure had been increased to 107. As more American forces were equipped with .45s, Japanese soldiers were increasingly likely to encounter them in combat, reinforcing their reputation as instruments of almost certain death. Japanese military leadership was well aware of the psychological impact the .45 was having on their forces, but they were largely powerless to address it effectively. Their own pistol production was inadequate both in quantity and quality, and the fundamental ballistic principles that made the .45 effective could not be easily replicated with Japan's wartime industrial capabilities. To save on scarce materials, low-quality steel was often used to build the Shiki Kenju. After war broke out between Japan and China in 1937, many Japanese servicemen learned to their horror that their Shiki Kenju sidearms possessed several deadly design flaws. The design flaws in Japanese pistols were not merely inconveniences, but potentially fatal handicaps in close combat. A completely exposed and protruding sear bar meant the pistol could fire without any trigger movement. Striking a sharp blow to the side of the gun often caused the weapon to discharge accidentally. Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen could very easily wind up shooting themselves while simply holstering loaded Type 94s. When facing American forces armed with reliable, powerful .45s, Japanese soldiers equipped with such unreliable weapons were at a severe psychological as well as tactical disadvantage. The industrial context of World War II made it impossible for Japan to quickly address the small arms disparity that was contributing to their soldiers' fear of the .45. Some 72,000 Type 94 pistols were made by the end of the war, and quality diminished greatly during the later stages of the war. And many of these cruder versions are the ones that were brought home in large numbers by returning American GIs, adding to the mythos of the poor quality of the Japanese Type 94 pistol. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity was producing 45s in unprecedented numbers. The total number of M1911A1 pistols manufactured during World War II was 1,742. Clearly, the 45 was an integral part of America's World War II infantry small arms arsenal. The sheer scale of American 45 production meant that Japanese forces were increasingly likely to encounter these weapons as the war progressed. This created a vicious cycle where Japanese fear of the 45 led to tactical changes that often made their forces more vulnerable to other American weapon systems. As banzai charges became less effective due to fear of close combat with 45 armed Americans, Japanese forces were forced to rely more heavily on defensive positions that were vulnerable to American artillery, air power, and flamethrowers. The effectiveness of the 45 in close quarters led some American units to seek out additional pistols beyond their normal allocation. Still, plenty of photos exist of combat troops in both the Pacific and European theaters of operations, with Colt U.S. Model 1917s in their holsters and/or hands. American troops are nothing if not good scroungers. This unofficial proliferation of American sidearms further increased the likelihood that Japanese forces would encounter 45s in combat, reinforcing their psychological impact. The technical superiority of the 45 over Japanese pistols was not just a matter of stopping power, but also reliability under combat conditions. Those claims were put to a torture test in 1910 when a prototype Colt M1911 fired 6,000 rounds during 2 days. Browning's sample pistol became so hot that he dunked in a pail of water to cool it for further firing, and yet it passed the test with no malfunctions. The nearest competition suffered 37 jams. This reliability was crucial in the high-stress environment of close combat, where a single malfunction could mean the difference between life and death. Japanese soldiers who had experienced combat against American forces often warned their comrades about the devastating effectiveness of the 45. These warnings, combined with the weapon's growing reputation, created a psychological burden that affected Japanese performance even before combat began. The greatest effect of the banzai charge was not casualties, but the decrease in morale in most Allied troops. Many soldiers feared the dreaded banzai attack, and this itself sometimes affected performance in the field. Ironically, the Japanese began to experience similar psychological effects regarding American small arms, particularly the 45. The fear of the 45 among Japanese forces was also amplified by their cultural context regarding small arms. Unlike Western military traditions that emphasized firearms training and marksmanship, Japanese military culture had historically placed greater emphasis on edged weapons and spiritual preparation. The Japanese tried their level best to equip their fighting men with the best they could produce. The cleaning rod also serves to act as a magazine loading tool, and they supplied an additional firing pin per pistol. Despite these efforts, Japanese small arms consistently failed to match American weapons in practical effectiveness. The psychological impact of the 45 was further magnified by the circumstances under which Japanese soldiers typically encountered it. Unlike rifle battles fought at longer ranges, pistol engagements occurred in the terrifying intimacy of close combat. Especially in the close quarters, our soldiers found themselves fighting in WW1. The 1911 was a last resort that could be depended upon to quickly put down an enemy. My uncles had to rely heavily on their issued 1911s, and they were able to put down the Nazi threats every time to make it back home. When they were alive, I only ever heard my uncles speak fondly of their issued 1911 and the venerable 45 ACP, and that they felt they had the sidearm advantage over the enemy. The effectiveness of the 45 in close combat situations where Japanese soldiers expected to have the advantage due to their training in bayonet fighting and hand-to-hand combat was particularly demoralizing. The weapon negated many of the advantages that Japanese forces had cultivated through intensive training and cultural conditioning. A Japanese soldier who had trained extensively in sword work and bayonet fighting could be stopped instantly by a single .45 ACP round, regardless of his skill or determination. As the war progressed and Japanese forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive, the psychological burden of facing American forces armed with .45s contributed to a general decline in morale and fighting effectiveness. Once the position of the defending force on an island had become untenable, a brave banzai charge, in which the defenders sought victory and death, usually terminated all organized resistance. Kuribayashi's intent of conserving his manpower and not staking all on a defense of the beaches or futile banzai charges was the epitome of the revised Japanese doctrine, already employed at Biak in the Southwest Pacific, to some extent in the Palaus, and very extensively on Luzon in the Philippines. The abandonment of the banzai charge as a primary tactic represented a fundamental shift in Japanese military doctrine, driven in part by the recognition that such charges were increasingly futile against well-armed American defenders. The final stratagem, which became effective in January 1945, called for the creation of strong, mutually supporting positions which were to be defended to the death. Neither large-scale counterattacks, withdrawals, nor banzai charges were contemplated. This tactical evolution represented an admission that close combat with American forces, particularly those armed with .45s, was no longer viable. The comparison between American and Japanese sidearms became a source of particular frustration for Japanese soldiers who understood firearms. Indeed, that's how I got familiar with the piece, though I still have a few packets of original ammunition, sized to fit that ammunition pouch on the holster. Recoil is different. The grip is quite small for an American's hand, so gripping it well takes practice, and the sights are a far cry from those on a GI-45. But they'll shoot to minute of torso, and that's more than fine. Japanese pistols, while capable of basic accuracy, lacked the stopping power and reliability that made the .45 so formidable in close combat. The industrial and logistical advantages that allowed America to equip its forces with superior small arms became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Following are the firms that made the M1911A1 pistol during World War II and their approximate production totals during this period. Ithaca Gun Cumber 400,000, Remington Rand 900,000, Colt 400,000, Union Switch and Signal 50,000. In addition, the Singer Company received an educational order for the production of 500 M19A1s, but the firm never produced the .45 in quantity. This massive production effort ensured that American forces would have access to superior sidearms throughout the war. Japanese attempts to address their small arms inferiority through captured weapons met with limited success. It's worth noting that while these were the main Japanese-produced pistols and revolvers, the Japanese military also used some captured weapons from other countries during WW2. It's worth noting that while these were the main Japanese-produced pistols and revolvers, the Japanese military also used some captured weapons from other countries during WW2. However, captured American weapons were rare and came with the significant disadvantage of requiring ammunition that Japanese forces could not produce domestically. The psychological impact of the 45 on Japanese forces was also amplified by its association with American military professionalism and industrial superiority. The weapon represented not just superior firepower, but the broader American advantage in equipment, training, and logistics. Japanese soldiers facing American forces armed with 45s were confronting evidence of their nation's inability to provide equivalent equipment for its own forces. The fear that Japanese soldiers developed for the 45 was based on hard experience rather than propaganda or battlefield rumors. While such stories are largely anecdotal, they spread widely among GIs, who had faith in the hitting power of their trusted 45s. These stories of the 45 in combat abound. But for Japanese forces on the receiving end of these weapons, the stories were not about American confidence, but about their own vulnerability and the inadequacy of their equipment. The effectiveness of the 45 against banzai charges had strategic implications that extended far beyond individual engagements. As Japanese commanders recognized that their traditional tactics were becoming counterproductive against well-equipped American forces, they were forced to adopt defensive strategies that played to American strengths in firepower and logistics. This tactical evolution, driven partly by fear of weapons like the 45, contributed to the overall decline in Japanese military effectiveness as the war progressed. The cultural significance of the 45's impact on Japanese forces extended beyond military considerations. The weapon represented a challenge to fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness that were deeply embedded in Japanese military culture. "It is a great weapon because of its stopping power," he said. "It instilled confidence in you because the 45 caliber round is a substantial round. It instilled confidence in you because the 45 caliber round is a substantial round." For Japanese soldiers facing these weapons, the 45 represented not just a tactical disadvantage, but a contradiction to their beliefs about the primacy of spirit over technology. The legacy of Japanese fear of the 45 extended into the post-war period, where captured American weapons became prized possessions among collectors and military historians. Most of the spare ammunition went to the bottom of the Pacific at war's end, making original-issue Nambu stuff somewhat difficult to find, though some was commercially produced here in the 70s, but even that has reached a collector status. Most of the spare ammunition went to the bottom of the Pacific at war's end, making original-issue Nambu stuff somewhat difficult to find, though some was commercially produced here in the 70s, but even that has reached a collector status. The contrast between the enduring reputation of captured American weapons and the collector curiosity value of Japanese sidearms reflects the lasting impact of their wartime performance differences. The continued use of the 45 by American Special Forces long after World War II testified to its effectiveness in the type of close-quarters combat where Japanese soldiers had first encountered it. Despite the fact that Congress pressured the Department of Defense to adopt the M9 Beretta because it used the standard NATO 9mm round, select units in the U.S. military continue to use the M1911 to this day. The Marine Corps, in particular, was reluctant to give up the M1911. This continued confidence in the weapon validated the fears that Japanese soldiers had developed during World War II. The technical specifications that made the 45 so effective against Japanese charges remained relevant in subsequent conflicts, where American forces faced determined attackers willing to accept casualties to close with their opponents. While most American firefights in World War II were fought with rifles and automatic weapons, the M11011A1 was a powerful supplement for the infantry. In years to follow, The outstanding performance of the Colt 45 would show up in countless combat reports and Medal of Honor citations. The weapon's reputation was built on consistent performance in the most demanding circumstances. The psychological warfare aspect of the 45's reputation among Japanese forces was ultimately as important as its ballistic performance. Fear of the weapon influenced Japanese tactical decisions, unit morale, and individual behavior in ways that extended far beyond the actual number of casualties it inflicted. News reports in the States told of charging natives withstanding 5 to 6 slugs before finally collapsing, but not before killing the soldier desperately trying to reload his revolver. With news of the enemy enduring what should have been fatal hits, the inadequacies of the .38 caliber revolver finally surfaced. The 45 represented the solution to the problem of stopping determined attackers, a solution that Japanese forces had no equivalent answer to. The industrial story behind the 45's dominance also reflected broader American advantages that Japanese forces came to fear. Although the term 1911 in many people's minds is synonymous with Colt 45 Auto, it is fact these pistols were produced by several other manufacturers, both prior to and during World War II. Such companies were Remington Arms, Springfield Armory, Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch and Signal, and even Singer, the sewing machine manufacturer. During World War II, the most prolific manufacturer was Remington Rand, former maker of typewriters, an item declared non-essential to the war effort in 1942. The ability to convert civilian manufacturing capacity to produce superior military weapons represented an advantage that Japan could never match. The fear that Japanese soldiers developed for the 45 was ultimately rooted in a realistic assessment of their tactical situation. They were facing an enemy equipped with superior weapons, supported by superior logistics, and backed by superior industrial capacity. The 45 became a symbol of all these disadvantages, concentrated in a single weapon system that negated many of the tactical and cultural advantages that Japanese forces had previously relied upon. The lasting impact of the 45 on Japanese military thinking extended beyond World War II into the post-war period, where lessons learned about American small arms effectiveness influenced Japanese assessment of American military capabilities more broadly. Next to his comrades and training, a soldier relies most on his combat equipment, and nothing was more deserving of this trust than the government model Colt 45, the most powerful military pistol in service during the war. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, the Colt performed with consistent efficiency under the harshest combat conditions. This consistent performance under extreme conditions was exactly what Japanese forces had learned to fear and expect from American weapons. In the final analysis, Japanese fear of the Colt 45 in World War II represented more than simple respect for a superior weapon. It represented recognition that American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and tactical adaptation had combined to create weapons systems that negated fundamental Japanese military advantages. The 45 was not just a pistol, it was a symbol of American military superiority that Japanese forces encountered at the most personal and terrifying level of combat. When Japanese soldiers heard the distinctive sound of a 45 being cocked in the darkness, they knew they were facing not just a weapon, but the technological and industrial might of a nation that could equip its forces with the finest small arms in the world. That knowledge, more than any banzai charge or spiritual preparation, was what truly terrified Japanese soldiers in the Pacific War. The Colt 45's psychological impact on Japanese forces was ultimately as devastating as its ballistic performance. In a war where both sides were prepared to die for their cause, the Japanese discovered that the Americans possessed a weapon that could kill more efficiently than they themselves were prepared to do. That realization, spreading through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese military like a contagion of fear, may have contributed as much to Japan's ultimate defeat as any strategic bombing campaign or naval blockade. The 45 did not just kill Japanese soldiers, it killed their confidence in their ability to prevail in close combat, and with it, one of the fundamental pillars of Japanese military doctrine in World War II.